So this is a VOR approach into Pleiku in Vietnam, and we flew this approach in managed selected mode, and I will show you how we did this. Most of the things went correctly except for one thing, and we'll talk about that later. So there's a few things to note about this approach. First, because it's a VOR approach, the distance of the track miles on the FMS is not correct. If you look at the ND, then you can see that the track miles here ends about 2 miles short of the runway where the missed approach point is. And you will have to take this into account for your profile calculation. So whatever the distance says on the FMS, then you have to add 2 miles to it to get the real distance. So let's try this for a profile calculation. So first you can see that we are approaching 50 miles here. So let's do a profile calculation for 50 miles. So 50 times 3 is fly level 150. We are doing 300 knots. So that makes fly level 120, and the airport elevation is 2,400 feet. So let's make it 2,500 feet for easy calculation. So adding 2,500 feet to fly level 120 makes fly level 145. So at 50 miles we should be at fly level 145 with this speed. Okay, so here comes 50 miles, but don't forget this distance is incorrect, so we have to add 2 miles. So the actual distance at 50 miles will be at 48 miles. So if I skip ahead a bit here, then here is actually 50 miles. So 48 miles makes 50 miles. We should be at fly level 145 and we're at fly level 135. So we are 1,000 feet too low. There's a little bit of a tailwind, and so we are quite heavy, so we'll just leave it like that. Okay. Next altitude check will be at 40 miles. Now you can see here we start to slow down to 250 knots a bit earlier. We're not at fly level 100 yet, but because of the high airfield elevation we take that into account, so we start to slow down a bit earlier. Okay, so we are approaching Madden here. We have to be above 9,000 feet, so that's fine here. And let's skip ahead to the next profile calculation. So let's do that now. So at 40 miles we should be at fly level 120. It's 40 times 3, fly level 120. We're slowing down to 250 knots, so by the time we do our calculation we should be at 250 knots. So have to subtract 2,000 feet, so fly level 120 becomes fly level 100. The airport elevation being 2,500 feet, adding that makes fly level 125. So at 40 miles we should be at fly level 125, doing 250 knots. Okay. Now again, because of the track miles not being correct, we have to wait for 38 miles. So let me skip ahead here, and there is 38 miles. Okay, so we should be at fly level 125. Okay, we're at fly level 120 now. So now we're 500 feet too low, so we're getting back on profile. Good. Now you can see here I put a speed restriction of 240 knots at the initial fix. That's an AKO requirement for a Cat C aircraft. For A321 this is actually 250 knots maximum. Of course you can fly slower if you want to. Okay, so far we are on profile, everything goes well. And the next calculation will be at 30 miles. So now the question is, what speed will we do there? I'm not sure, so let's just wait until we're a bit closer to 30 miles. Okay, so it looks like we're still doing 250 knots there. Okay, so let's do that calculation, and let me just pause the video here. So 30 miles times 3 makes 9,000 feet, doing 250 knots, so 2,000 feet lower makes 7,000 feet, and adding the airport elevation makes 9,500 feet. So at 30 miles with this speed here, 250 knots, we should be at 9,500 feet. Again, we have to wait for 28 miles, because that's the actual distance of 30 miles there, right there. And we should be at 9,500 feet, and we are almost exactly on profile. Good. Now you can see that the aircraft overshoots the intercept of the arc here a bit. That's not too much of a problem. Why that is, not sure. The aircraft was actually at the correct speed except for about 5 knots before that. Maybe because of a bit of a wind direction here. Could be that the aircraft sometimes overshoots. You could always reduce the speed a bit if you don't want this. Okay, so now a few things to note about the high airfield elevation also, that if there's vertical speed restrictions or speed restrictions, you have to of course take that into account also for not so you don't bust these restrictions if there are any. There could be any company limitations, so don't forget that. Okay, so next calculation will be at 20 miles, and the speed which we'll be doing, let's see, it looks like still about 240 knots, so 250 knots. Okay, so let's do that calculation now. So 20 miles times 3 makes 6,000 feet. With 250 knots, have to fly 2,000 feet lower, so that makes 4,000 feet. Adding the airport elevation of 2,500 feet makes 6,500 feet. So at 20 miles, we should be at 6,500 feet. And again, subtracting 2 miles to get the actual distance makes 18 miles. So there we go, there's 18 miles, should be at 6,500 feet. Okay, we're at 7,000 feet, so slightly high here. Okay, now do we have to fix that? Yeah, possibly. There's definitely a bit of a tailwind and we're kind of heavy. I didn't apply any speed brake here. Later you'll see that actually I should have done that because we are getting a little bit high on energy. Okay. Actually we are not quite 250 knots either, which is sort of in between green dot and 250 knots, so you could argue we are actually on profile here. Okay, now you can see a little bit of weather here. Actually we were flying below that. This was a small rain cloud. We were flying below that weather already, so that wasn't really an issue. Okay, let's continue. Last height check will be at, oh, one thing I forgot to mention, that normally you start to slow down from 250 knots to green dot at 5,000 feet, but don't forget that's 5,000 feet above the ground, above the airfield elevation. And so if you add 5,000 feet plus 2,500 feet, it makes 7,500 feet. So that's why it's 7,500 feet here. And that's where I started to slow down the green dot. So that's why it appears to be a bit early, but actually that's not the case. Okay, so let's continue to the last height check we do is at 15 miles, 15 miles. And so just remembering the 15 times 3 is 4,500 feet. And we are slowing down to green dot speed now, so we can take green dot speed as a reference. So 4,500 feet minus 1,000 feet to slow down makes 3,500 feet. Adding the airfield elevation of 2,500 feet makes 6,000 feet. Okay, so we should be at 6,000 feet at 13 miles. 15 miles minus 2 miles for the offset. So let's wait for 13 miles, and there is 13 miles. We should be at 6,000 feet. Okay, still a little bit high, about 400 feet. Okay, so at some point we should apply the speed brake to get rid of that energy. Now 400 feet at 15 miles, that may or may not be a problem. But you have to take the wind and the weight into account. The wind at the moment is not affecting us because it's a crosswind, but we are a bit heavy, so we should really apply the speed brake here. I didn't do that yet, which is a bit late. Okay, and later I did this, which is too late. Okay, but then we'll see later what will happen. Okay, now the other thing is like when to configure. Now normally we do this at 15 miles, 15 miles. We start to we select flap 1 and start to slow down to S speed, but again because of the track being incorrect, that's actually at 13 miles. That makes 15 miles. Okay, so at 13 miles we should ask for flap 1. Okay, so here's 13 miles and flap 1 is selected. Good. Now okay, we start to slow down to S speed, and a few things to keep in mind here. Because we are doing a selected approach, selected vertically, you want to have a level segment before you start to descend, because you have to pull FPA at 0.3 miles before, And if you are already descending, that doesn't really make sense to pull 0.3 miles before. It will not intercept. It might not intercept the correct slope if you do it that way. Also, you want to be fully configured before you start to descend. That's to prevent any flap balloon. And actually, we were a bit late selecting flap, and you can see later what will happen. So you definitely want to have at least a little bit of a level segment here before you start to descend, being fully configured there. Now you also don't want to configure too early, because flying level with gear down, flap full, that burns a lot of fuel, so you don't want to do that. So you want to time it correctly. Okay, so the other thing is, at the moment we're still using normal flight directors, not in FPA mode. And the reason for that is because if you are on the not on the approach yet, you're still on the arrival or on the arc, or on if you do a teardrop procedure, you might want to go into a vertical speed mode. That's a bit easier to manage the approach, so you don't want to change to FPA mode too early. Okay, so let's see in real time what's happening now. So we are slowing down to S speed. Before we were already a little bit high, and you can see that creates slight trouble, not trouble, but some workload increase right now. So as we slow down to S speed, you can also see that we are quite heavy. We are 64 tons, and that creates a small gap between S speed and VFA next. There's flap 2. Now, of course, if you select flap 2, it's gonna balloon. And you can see I selected the speed brake here. Let me just go back a little bit. Okay, so here I selected the speed brake because I saw this distance here is not being too much, and knowing that I want to have a level segment, wasn't quite happy with that. So I applied the speed brake, then selected flap 2, and of course it will. There you go, flap 2. Then it will balloon. The speed is quite close to Vmax here. That's normal because of being heavy. You will always get that when the VFA next is very close to S speed. So as soon as you select flap 2, it will be close to Vmax. That's perfectly normal. If there's some turbulence, you do want to not have a too high vertical speed, so you don't overspeed the flaps. But at the moment we're in this open descent mode, so that doesn't matter. It will just first go for the speed here. Okay, speed brake still selected. Now I can see that there's a bit of a gap, not too much of a gap here between VLS and Vmax here. So I get rid of the speed brake here. Okay, of course it balloons. Waited for the speed to reduce a little bit more. Now at this moment I also wasn't too happy with that. Of course I don't want to go all the way to F speed, because then you will get a really low descent rate. And again, I want to have a level segment here, so I didn't like the way this looked here. So I quickly changed to selected speed mode and selected the higher speed here. What that does in open descent, it will just push the nose down, and that will force it to descend a bit quicker. So that's what I did here, you can see. And soon it will go to Alt Star, now speed. Now as soon as it goes to Alt Star, you want to, let me go back a bit here, you want to get rid of your speed bug. If the speed bug is selected higher than your current speed, it will put the power on. Now you don't want to do that when you're high on energy. So as soon as it goes into Alt Star, you manage your speed, so the speed bug becomes F speed, which is below the current speed, and that will force the thrust at idle. So that's why I did this. So there's Alt Star, manage the speed, and the thrust remains at idle. Okay. Now next we have to quickly configure more, because here's the descent point. Now a little bit about the descent point. So if you look at the approach chart here, you can see that the platform altitude being 5,580 feet, it's kind of strange. Why is it not 6,000 feet? Now that's because all the altitudes in Vietnam, they are converted from meters to feet, and the reason being because it's officially a military airspace, and all the military aircraft using meter gauges, because most of them are from Russia. And so they decided to keep all the rounded altitudes in meters, but that means that the altitudes in feet are they end up being kind of strange numbers. Now, of course, you cannot set 5,580 feet. You have to set 5,600 feet. So you have to recalculate the descent point. So if you look at the chart, then on the altitude height check chart, you can see that for 5,580 feet, the distance to descent is 10.9 miles. But you will not fly at 5,580 feet. You will fly at 5,600 feet. Now, in this case, the difference is not that much. It's only 20 feet, but sometimes it's 90 feet difference if you have to round it up. So that can make a difference. So you have to recalculate the altitude or the distance where you should start to descend. Now, there's several ways to do that. There's one method described in the book I published, Practical Descent Energy Management, and there's another method in one of the other videos I describe how to recalculate the descent point, and that's a presentation about the VOR approach. So if you calculate what the descent point should be, it works out at 11 miles. Okay, so if the descent point is at 11 miles to make a continuous descent, then you should pull FPA at 11.3 nautical miles. Okay, so you have to pay attention to the distance to the VOR. Now, talking about distance, so you can see already that there's a few types of distance we use, or sources of distance. So before we use the distance on the FMS for the profile calculation. Now, in order to decide when to configure, we use and also for the height checks later on the approach, we can use two different distances. So for the height checks, we always have to use the VOR distance, and to decide when to configure, or in this case when to pull VS, we use pull FPA, we use the VOR distance also. And later, if you want to know exactly the latest when you have to configure for gear down and flap full, in the case you are doing a fully managed approach, then you will have to take the distance to the threshold and multiply that by 3, and then you know the height above the airfield elevation. But in this case, it will be fully configured before we start the descent, so that won't be an issue. Now, okay, so we have to pull FPA at 11.3 miles, and you can see it already changed to FPA mode here. Okay, now you can pre-select the VOR, you can pre-select the FPA about 1 mile before you start to descend. So that'll be at 12.3 miles. You can do that earlier, but you have to keep the FPA pre-selected number alive by turning the knob forward and backward, so it won't time out. Okay, so let's see what's going to happen. So now we still have to select flap 3 and flap full, and let's continue with the video. Okay, so at least it will fly level now. Well, sort of. You can see that the gear is now selected down, waiting for 3 greens, and we can select flap 3, getting really close to the descent point now of 11.3 where I have to pull. So waiting for, you can't see that here, but 3 greens on the landing gear, and then select flap 3. There's flap 3. Now you can see it starts to climb a little bit, but of course it's in alt mode, and then shortly after flap full is selected here. Now, but also we're almost at our descent point of the point where we have to pull FPA, which is at 11.3 miles. Now watch what happens. So flap full selected, and it actually starts climbing a little bit, even though it was in alt mode. So I select FPA minus 3 degrees now, but because it was still climbing, we actually overshoot the descent point a little bit. Now, anytime that you are getting high, you have to set a higher FPA of minus 4 in this case. You want to set a number which is large enough. Now, a mistake which is often made is that the FPA is changed to another number which is not high enough, maybe 3.1 or 3.2 degrees, but that doesn't do much. If you look at the vertical speed, if you set 4 degrees down, the vertical speed which you get in this case is it's only 1,000 feet a minute, so it's really not that much. It looks like a higher number here, but it's actually not the case. Okay, so now we are fully configured, flap full, gear down, and now we have to do the landing checklist at some point, but we don't have landing no green yet. And that will be at 2,000 feet from the red out, so we have to wait for that. And that's another thing you have to watch out for, that there's no real trigger for the landing checklist. If you would be on the ILS approach, then usually you can select, okay, flap 3, flap full, and then you say landing checklist goes. In most cases, by that time you'll be below 2,000 feet of the red out. But in this case, that's you're flying higher, so you have to wait for the red out to be 2,000 feet and not forget to do the landing checklist. Okay, so now we have to continuously modify or monitor the vertical profile. So we're doing height checks every mile, and at some point you can see that it starts to get a little bit low. And for that you will have to modify the FPA until you're back on profile, and then reset it back to 3 degrees. Now, as you can see here, another thing what I want to mention is that in the FCOM states, okay, aim to be fully configured by the final fix, or actually not fully configured, but at least the gear down flap 2. But in this case that will be too late, because in this airport the final fix, if you work it out, it's actually only just over 1,500 feet above the ground, above the airfield elevation, I should say. So that's way too late. So you cannot look at this waypoint to judge when you should start to configure. You really have to look at the distance instead. Okay, so let's continue. So now here we're gonna adding up a little bit on the low side. So we adjust the flight path angle to a bit less until we're back on profile. Now once we're back on profile, I'm gonna increase the flight path angle again to 3 degrees to continue flying the correct vertical profile. Okay, so here the red out becomes alive, and then we're waiting for 2,000 feet to do the landing checklist. Now you can see it starts to become a little bit turbulent because we have quite a bit of a crosswind here, and there's mountains all around this airport. So that can become a little bit high workload once you start to fly manually. Okay, so there's 2,000 feet, so landing the blue, so we can start the landing checklist now. Okay. Now the next question, when should you disconnect the autopilot? Well, it depends. Of course you have to be visual, but you don't want to disconnect the autopilot too late, especially if there's a big offset between the approach track and the runway track. And it really depends on kind of the weather conditions and such, and if the runway is visible well. So you don't want to disconnect too late either, because then there's not much time to align the aircraft with the runway, and then not too far, because then you can't really see the runway well enough and you might not even be visual. So usually 1,500 feet or thereabouts is a good point to disconnect the autopilot. So here's the autopilot is disconnected. Now next call, autopilot off, flight directors off, set runway track. Okay, of course you have to have the runway track ready, so the pilot monitoring should have that ready, and set the runway track. So now what you want to do now is align the aircraft with the runway. Now there's a few things to note here. First, you want to know if the approach track is any different from the runway track, which it is in this case. It's only 2 degrees, it's not that much, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. And the first thing you want to do is to fly towards the extended runway center line, which you can't see on the display, but you kind of have to look out the window and imagine where the extended runway center line is, and note the wind. So in this case we have a strong left crosswind, and that means that we have to okay, the first turn to the left, you can see that here, to align the aircraft with the extended center line, and then roll out depending on the wind direction and speed to fly parallel with the runway track. And so if there's a strong crosswind from the left, in this case we roll out a little bit later. So once we're on the extended center line, which you can't really see here, but outside you can see that, then you align the bird with the track line, and then it should stay more or less on the actual runway center line. Now at some point, let me go back a bit, the brake will disappear. So if you do the height checks, you should check if the brake is correct. Now if it is correct, you can use that. Once you disconnect the autopilot, you can just fly the brake here. Now the way to do that is you look at your vertical speed, take half the ground speed, and you fly the half the ground speed as vertical speed. Now once you get a little bit high, like in this case, you increase the vertical speed, not more than 1,000 feet a minute, below 1,000 feet above the ground, above the airfield elevation, and you wait until you're back on profile, and then you set half the ground speed as vertical speed again. That's how to fly it, and the opposite if you get low. So then if you get low, you reduce the vertical speed until you're back on profile, and then you increase the vertical speed to half the ground speed again. So it's very important to keep monitoring the vertical speed once you're flying manually. Okay. So now we're getting back on profile. Okay, the brake is removed now in this case. Okay, so then you just have to look outside, taking into account the PAPIs. Unfortunately, in this airfield, the PAPIs are incorrect. So you really just have to judge the height of the vertical profile by just looking outside. And if you decide that you're low, okay, you apply the same principle. Then you increase, you decrease the vertical speed a bit until you're back on profile, and then set half the ground speed again. So keep flying you really have to keep an eye on the vertical speed, set it at half the ground speed, like 700 feet in this case, 700 feet a minute. And of course you're at the same time you're also tracking the center line, so it's not that easy. Also a bit of a crosswind here, it's a reasonably short runway, and a bit of a downslope on the touchdown zone. So here we're getting close to the ground, and at the 30 feet, close to thrust levers. And now when you have to flare, it really depends on the descent rate. You can't really pick a number for that. But okay, so here we're on the ground, so flare, kick the rudder before we touch down. Okay, so that's the end of the video. Now I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below.